It's not a stretch to look at cinema as this vast graveyard. A lot of people go to old movies to see dead people, to hear dead actors. Movies are the most haunted art form.
I think when we look at some of the stories we're attracted to in cinema, it's always a balance between attraction and repulsion. And what captures that better than a ghost? It's something that we want to know about, it's something that we want to discover, but of course we're also repulsed by and terrified.
Ultimately, every ghost movie is a mystery. We're wondering why these rules of life and death are broken, what caused it, and why is a ghost sticking around. Antonio Bay is kind of an interesting setting for a ghost story in the fog, because rather than a haunted place or a haunted person, it's an entire haunted city.
Antonio Bay is a ghost town, but at the same time, it's imbued with this liveness. It sort of takes on its own life. There's all these quiet, still shots of empty streets at night, one after the other. It has that degree of attention to place and texture and feel and atmosphere.
It's a ghost story about a bunch of dead sailors taking revenge on a small coastal town. But what made it a cult classic was its atmosphere and its score, two things that John Carpenter films are known for.
The Fog really achieves this really distinct look just by blasting every shot with a ton of fog. It really adds to this otherworldly feel that really gives the film its look and its kind of visual edge.
The Fog is an interesting ghost movie in that, number one, they may not be ghosts. They also might be zombies. They're also zombie ghost lepers. Like, they've got a lot of hyphens going on. And I think that's because John Carpenter isn't entirely clear on what they are either. The idea came to him when he was on a press tour with Deborah Hill, his producing partner at the time. And they, of course, visited Stonehenge, and the fog rolled in, and he went, "This is my next movie. We're gonna make it about the fog."
I love that John Carpenter, straight out of the gate, had a hit with Halloween, and then he didn't follow it up with Halloween 2. He had someone else direct that film, and instead went and made The Fog, which is a terrific ghost film. But the thing you have to always remember with John Carpenter is that despite the horror genre, he's ultimately making a Western. And he had Haddonfield in Halloween, and he has Antonio Bay in The Fog, which is a town besieged by, instead of a single lone stranger like Michael Myers, a whole posse rides into town, and they just happen to be ghost pirates.
What's fascinating about John Carpenter's The Fog is that he wanted it to be unknowable, that he wanted the threat to be always from the sides, and the viewer would not really know what it is.
You can outrun Michael Myers, theoretically. You can kill Michael Myers, theoretically. He exists in a space that is confined, but the fog, not so much.
I never really think of Beetlejuice as a ghost. I usually think of him as more of like a demon-like figure.
But he's the ghost with the most. He says so himself.
The juice is loose.
Yeah.
He kind of looks like a demon, like he's got a bunch of crusty stuff on his face, but he is a ghost. He looks great. Outfit on point, iconic, but also he has some very unique powers.
Beetlejuice is craziness on film, and I think you see that really powerfully in the moment where his face sort of opens up and wiggles that you catch from the back.
What do you think of this? You like it?
Beetlejuice is maybe the ultimate Tim Burton film. Every element works. And the thing that's kind of remarkable about it is that Beetlejuice is in the movie for like 15 minutes. He's just one of those characters that when he pops up, you feel his presence even when he's off the screen. And every time he's off the screen, you're just sitting there going, where's Beetlejuice? When's Beetlejuice gonna come back?
Michael Keaton is a force of chaos in that movie, partially because he barely filmed with the other actors. He was very, very frequently filming on his own set, so they improvise half of the stuff he does. In fact, he would often go over to Tim Burton's house and they would just riff for hours and hours and hours.
In Beetlejuice, you know, we get a very Michael Keaton-y kind of demon, a demon we've never really seen exactly this way before. He's gross, he's a pervert, he's a lech, he's loud, he's unrepentant. And I mean, that's actually what a demon should be.
What are your qualifications?
Well, I attended Juilliard. I'm a graduate of the Harvard Business School. I travel quite extensively. I lived through the Black Plague, and I had a pretty good time during that. I've seen The Exorcist about 167 times, and it keeps getting funnier every single time I see it.
I don't think anybody could have delivered that line the way he did.
Beetlejuice is basically an embodied bad decision. He's everything you wish you could touch because you see how delicious it is to be in that space, but he shows you how bad it can be to let go.
When I was a kid watching old cartoons, I never liked Casper the Friendly Ghost because you had Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Popeye, you know, two-fisted guys. But Casper was a friendly ghost. He would spend the whole cartoon moping.
Originally, Casper the Friendly Ghost was a child of two ghosts, which means he was never dead. And then for the movie, they thought, hey, this is a kid's movie. Let's make this uplifting and make him an actual dead child.
As a child, I loved the 1995 version of Casper, and revisiting it as an adult made me realize just how sad and melancholic it is underneath all of its goofiness.
There's a scene where Casper recounts to Kat his own death. He remembers when he fell ill. He remembers his parents crying. He remembers the moment that he was no longer living. And that is massively existential for a children's film.
Casper holds up, and I think one of the reasons it does so is that the CGI is very much in the same kind of style as Roger Rabbit, where it's for kids, so they're all still very cartoony. They're all still very big.
I think because Casper was meant for kids, so he's designed to be this very round, very bubbly, very friendly ghost. But it is a really great way of, I think, introducing this more spiritual side to children because it is presented in a very family-friendly way that you can relate to it when you're young.
The 80s and 90s were kind of different when it came to making ghost movies or horror movies. You could push death on kids, and there's a lot of death in this movie. I think what they do to make it less scary for children in this film is by making a lot of the deaths really comical.
At the end, I think it's a really sweet story about two people who live in different worlds, quite literally, and come together over their shared desire for friendship.
When it comes to Guillermo del Toro and ghosts, he tends to take a very classic take on a ghost story, meaning that the ghosts are crimes of the past that are being revisited on the future, ghosts that have unfinished business with the living.
Like most of Guillermo del Toro's monsters, I think in the end you find in his ghost stories that these ghosts are actually benevolent forces. You're misjudging them because of how they look, but they are all trying to help our main characters in any way they can.
A big thing with Del Toro's work in general is rethinking this assumption that because something is unnatural or scary or strange, that means that it's inherently bad.
He doesn't do ghosts like Western ghosts. They are terror at first, but they're terror that is actually offering safety. It's a very non-Western look at how to hold the past as important.
Del Toro as a director, he's definitely been fascinated with ghosts throughout his career and also in his personal life. He's said in interviews before that he experienced ghosts twice in his life. There was once when he was 11, and it was, he thinks, his uncle who had just passed away, and he moved into his uncle's bedroom to live as a kid. And then another time when he was adult. And he seems to have this really intrinsic idea that, one, ghosts are real, that ghosts do exist within the world, and it's not so much a scary prospect so much as it's almost a heartwarming thing that they're here to fulfill something in their life that was a bit unsatisfied. For me, I find that to be a really a much more nuanced and interesting look to ghosts as opposed to just that they're scary. And I think that Del Toro's movies certainly do that.
Elvira is the main ghost in Blythe Spirit, and she is, I'm gonna say, delicious.
I think what makes Blythe Spirit so engaging all these many years after its release is just how bright and brilliant all the dialogue is. These are quick-talking characters, they're witty, they're catty, they're fighting.
Please mind your own business.
If you behaving like a lunatic isn't my business, I don't know what is.
I expect they were about me, weren't they? I know I ought to feel sorry, but I'm not. I'm delighted.
Writer Noel Coward felt that Elvira and the acidic tone of Blythe Spirit were necessary because the play and the movie were being created during World War II. He thought that if these characters had any ounce of sympathy, it would remind an audience of the mass casualties and the horrors of war.
It's a really fascinating ghost story because it's, for the most part, a romantic comedy. A tale of a threesome that only one person seems to really be interested in being in.
One of the reasons this movie works is that Rex Harrison doesn't actually seem to like any of his wives. Like, he's not into anybody. So if there was this big feeling of loss where he's like, I have mourned for years over the loss of my wife Elvira, that Elvira coming back and trying to kill him just wouldn't have the same kind of aplomb.
One of the charms of Blythe Spirit is how boorish the undead are, and how difficult it is for Charles to try to entertain both the living and the dead. So much of the comedy comes from him talking to one wife and the other one not realizing she's there.
The ghost effects in this film actually won Oscars, and now when you're looking at it, you're kind of like, okay, you know, some things are floating, the doors are opening, but you kind of have to imagine what this would have looked like on a big screen with like just this gauzy haze sort of thing, and this woman who is just ethereal floating onto the screen. This would have been real cool.
The way that she looks is beautiful. The special effects are pretty iconic. She kind of has this green pallor to her the whole time.
At its heart, Blythe Spirit is very silly, and that was kind of a rare thing for David Lean. This is a comedy from a director not known for his comedies, and I think Blythe Spirit really pairs slapstick and the supernatural beautifully.
I'm not normally one for horror comedies, but The Frighteners is just so much fun.
The Frighteners occupies an interesting place in Peter Jackson's filmography. It's coming after the early transgressive underground movies like Meet the Feebles, but it's before his shift into blockbuster filmmaking.
The fact that Jackson ended up being trusted with so much money for Lord of the Rings is kind of crazy, considering what a reckless and subversive filmmaker he is. This is all a total compliment to The Frighteners, which is one of those studio movies from the 90s that feels kind of out of control.
I love that this was an American film, but it's so obviously filmed in New Zealand that just really gives it this strange kind of off-kilter quality. The vibes are very, very bizarre in this movie.
So the ghosts in this film are really fun because they kind of play around with the idea of what ghosts can do and how they interact with their physical surroundings. They're sort of made up of this like goopy ectoplasm, which just looks great on screen.
I would like some new clothes. You get to dress nice. Here I am still looking like Link from the Mod Squad.
You died in the 70s. It's a bummer.
I feel like an important thing to note about The Frighteners is how exciting the special effects were at the time. The way these ghosts looked, the way they interacted, the kind of cartoonishness was really exciting and new.
One of the things I love about Peter Jackson's The Frighteners is that it treats ghosts like Looney Tunes characters. Peter Jackson was in love with what CGI could do at the time, and he allows it to like bend and stretch bodies that you could never do practically.
It's a jewel in Peter Jackson's crown. It's already a cinematic crown festooned with jewels, but this one really is a shining gem. If you haven't seen it, you must.
I remember seeing The Others when it came out and being so scared. It is a film that really gets under your skin, not because it has scary special effects or does anything really unusual. It's all about mood and tone and dread.
This is a really interesting film because as a ghost story, it works on the standard chilling level, creepy noises in the house. But then also when you think about it in terms of depression and the way how depression can lock people in a vicious cycle, can make people do terrible things. And everyone essentially starts to realize that Grace is probably the most destructive person in the house. She's the one that everyone should be afraid of, but she doesn't realize it in herself.
Throughout the film, there's this dread, this feeling that something's wrong. And what's really effective about The Others is that it's Grace's slow journey to discover that the thing that is wrong is her.
Mom, I heard shots. She wants to kill me. She won't stop until she kills us. She won't stop. She won't stop until she kills us. Come with me. Come with me. You're wicked. You're wicked, wicked.
It's really sort of a movie that gets inside the feeling of what it might be to actually be a ghost, where that loneliness really has to do with the fact that no one's around, time is passing you by.
What Grace represents for people is someone who just can't get over what happened because of guilt, because of extreme grief. The idea that we can be haunted by the things we did even after our loved ones are dead, even after we're dead. The fact that we can't atone for the wrongs that we did. That's a terrifying notion, that you could go to your grave regretting your life, and that even in death, you would be trapped by that. I think that's what gets under your skin about this movie.
It's interesting to look back at the film and see a ghost that's exhausted and in turmoil because she thinks she's alive.
What is more haunting than you never knowing that you're the ghost, stuck and locked in a prison of an era of your life that you never escape because you are haunted by something unreconciled?
The Haunting is often noted as one of the scariest films of all time. And of course, it's not scary to today's standards, but in 1963, it was chock full of terror.
And anytime anyone asks me what's the scariest horror film, it's The Haunting. And yet it's a movie in which so much of the fear is manifested from stuff that you're just not seeing. First of all, they found an incredible estate to shoot the film in. And it just feels like the house is breathing. There's that amazing sequence where it actually feels like the doors are breathing in the house.
Robert Wise so beautifully filmed this with a rubber door that made it actually push in and out. So you see this wooden door, but it is breathing, it's pounding with the pounding sound, and it is terrifying.
It's funny to me because as soon as you walk into that house, there's no question that there's something creepy happening there.
The set design by Elliot Scott is just so striking because it feels both claustrophobic and too grand. This is not a safe space. This is not something that's part of our world that we know about.
One of the things that makes The Haunting totally visually unique and extremely spooky is the fact that director Robert Wise and the director of photography, David Bolton, were using these anamorphic lenses that hadn't ever been tested before. So the result is you get a lot of very distorted and disturbing images that they couldn't have even planned in advance.
The sound design for the era too, where you're dealing with limited tracks, it's so dense, there's so much foreboding malevolence just to every corner of the film. It's such an impressive film.
While the Shirley Jackson novel that The Haunting is based on is very explicit about the story being of a supernatural nature, the screenplay for The Haunting by Nelson Gidding, it walks a much more ambiguous line. We don't really know if what's happening in the film is supernatural or if in fact this is all manifestations of some acute mental illness.
I kind of like that this movie very much combines those two elements, and to the point where you can't really take this fragile woman out of the fact that she is tormented by her own mind and ghosts.
fun thing about The Innkeepers is that for the first like 75 minutes, the ghosts are almost irrelevant. There may not even be any. We never really know. We know that the hotel is said to be haunted, but mostly we're just watching a couple of people who work there goof off with each other and try to scare each other and then eventually, have to realize that something is going on.
The Innkeepers captures an interesting moment in time where a lot of people are becoming amateur ghost hunters. Now we know there's full TV channels of ghost hunters and things like that, but this was a pretty early movie showing how people can just buy this equipment and try to find ghosts.
The Innkeepers is Ty West's ghost story. It is an exploration of ghost hunting as a practice. And it follows the formula of ghost hunting in the formula of actually how the movie works. So you're looking around, you're waiting for something to happen, and then suddenly something does.
The Innkeepers is a really kind of slow brew ghost story. And what I think is so interesting is the fact that Claire, our main character, is really embodying this kind of childish, innocent, fun-loving charm, and in doing so runs up against spirits that she is unprepared for.
When the answers are provided, they're not provided to the audience. Sarah Paxton's character gets an answer. And that's sort of the climax of the film, but the movie is so quiet and controlled and measured in how it wants to show us what it wants to show us that we never get to see anything. We just get to see what it does to people, which, honestly, that's pretty scary on its own.
There's so much to love about The Changeling. Even though it might be one of the saddest ghost movies of all time, it is still one of the spookiest, it is the most atmospheric, and it is still one of the most influential Canadian films that's ever been made.
In The Changeling, we focus on John Russell, who's a grieving father and husband, and he moves into this old mansion and realizes that this mansion is haunted.
It's always interesting in horror films when someone experiences a tragedy. So having to see his wife and child killed, which then makes him vulnerable or more susceptible to the supernatural. So this isn't his wife and child haunting him, but rather an opportunity to save someone when he couldn't do so before.
The way Joseph haunts the Changeling is kind of through things like a wheelchair moving on its own and a ball rolling. You don't really get to see him properly. And yet we're given his full backstory, and it's profoundly upsetting and tragic.
So in the 70s, when horror movies started becoming A-list, there was this wonderful tendency you had to just cast the most serious old guard actors possible so you know that things are actually bad. So if George C. Scott thinks that there's some sort of weird, creepy, wheelchair-bound ghost out to get him in this house, you tend to find it credible. You tend to be on his side.
With The Changeling, we get one of the first examples on film of kind of manipulating audio. We have our lead character turning up the volume on a recording, only to hear in the background this terrifying voice of a child calling out for help. It's been used a lot in films after it, but it really originates with The Changeling.
Are you the child killed by the cold cart?
In terms of influence, like Spielberg's talked about this being kind of what incited Poltergeist for him and wanting to executive produce that and create it into a film. The best part of this movie, and I think the thing that's the most influential that you're gonna see used in a number of other films, is the automatic writing scene. It is intense, it is scary, it is visceral, and you don't know what's going to happen. And it's a very early example of like super quick cut editing and intensely used sound to make you feel that same level of tension. It's really a remarkable scene, and you can see why other people have wanted to imitate it.
The Sixth Sense is very interesting because it is a film that asks the question, what if you could see every ghost around you? Obviously, Haley Joel Osment's character is overwhelmed by this fact. It is terrifying.
I remember seeing The Sixth Sense for the first time in theaters, not knowing how the film ended, and everyone talks about the twist, and that's all great. But for me, it was the moment where that little arm shoots out from under the bed that I remember jumping in my seat. And that's the little arm of Kira, played by Misha Barton.
Kira is so unsettling when you first meet her. Like, she's puking out of her mouth, like it's a full Exorcist vibe. And they do a really good job of sort of humanizing her as like Cole gains the courage to face her head on. And I think because she's a kid, they have that more comfortable dynamic with each other.
There's a parable here for coming of age, for becoming mature, because he sees this barfing ghost child and he's frightened, but the minute he develops empathy for her, his fear is conquered.
M. Night Shyamalan's movies often use color in the costumes and generally as points of focus for the viewer. In The Sixth Sense, that's red. Red is always to symbolize the presence of evil or the spirit world, and it sort of tells the viewer what's going to happen.
Kira is trying to let Cole know about how she was murdered by her mother. Her mother is wearing a red blazer at her funeral, which I don't think is something you would do.
You have that amazing emotional sequence where Haley Joel Osment finds the videotape and brings it to her father, and he has to sit there and watch what his wife has done to their child.
The Sixth Sense was a breakout hit that put M. Night Shyamalan on the map. It was a banger of a ghost story, even if you didn't realize it was entirely a ghost story until that final twist ending.
It's hard to think of a more terrifying transformation than the arrival of Large Marge, the seemingly benign truck driver, when Pee-wee goes on his big adventure. She's arriving in a truck to save him in the dead of night, and there he is in his little suit with his bindle. And she's gender reversing coded with a big buffalo check.
Thanks for stopping.
I know Alice Nunn has been in other films, but she's always going to be remembered as Large Marge. This is a character that appears very briefly in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, but I love that Tim Burton and Paul Rubens make this truck driver a woman wearing plaid, and that she's just kind of like this bride of Frankenstein, totally unhinged.
Large Marge in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, I don't think she's very scary. I lied, she's so scary.
Traumatized generations of children.
I love the use of stop motion animation to animate Large Marge's ghostly specter. It's funny, or it's supposed to be funny, but to a little kid, it's actually really terrifying. And when you talk to 80s kids, they all say that this scene gave them horrific nightmares.
Pee-wee's Big Adventure in general is kind of dealing with this old idea of America being a bunch of disconnected small towns with these long stretches of highway between them. There's a lot of roadside attractions and a lot of urban legends at play.
Pee-wee's Big Adventure is about American mythology and American folklore. And this kind of ghost truck driver is sort of our century's version of the Headless Horseman.
At the end, I think that Large Marge, like so much of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, is part of a love letter to America.
What Lies Beneath is a weird little movie of where it falls in Zemeckis' kind of oeuvre, in that it was shot very, very quickly while he was waiting for Tom Hanks to get very skinny and grow a beard after Castaway. And he's like, I can't sit still for 5 seconds. What do I do now? I'm gonna direct what is essentially a two-hander with two of the biggest movie stars on the planet and a ghost.
So it's really Zemeckis being like, what if I kind of made my own modern version of a Hitchcock film, but I put ghosts in there? So he takes the voyeurism of Rear Window, he takes the mirroring aesthetic of Vertigo, puts it in a blender, adds a platinum blonde, AKA Michelle Pfeiffer, adds a little sprinkle of ghost, and you've got What Lies Beneath.
I think when you're casting a ghost character, you look for an actor that is very uncanny, perhaps unappealing in some ways, someone that's gonna really scare people. But Robert Zemeckis with What Lies Beneath looked to the Victoria's Secret runway and cast Amber Valletta.
Madison is Norman's dead lover, and she is haunting his wife Claire because she wants Claire to find out that her husband's a murderer and also to save her from being his next victim. So there's this real sense of protection, like women protecting each other.
A ghost film relies a lot on tone. It really relies on the sense of creepiness. And what I love about What Lies Beneath is the use of Steadicam in order to capture that tone. Even if you don't see Madison, you always know that she's present because you feel the camera kind of floating around like you were a ghost, like you were the one watching Claire. And it really kind of creates this creepy, voyeuristic feeling to the film.
Freddy Krueger. He's pretty iconic in the horror realm, but I don't know if we think about him as a ghost as much as we should, because that's what he is.
I never think of Freddy Krueger as a ghost because once you start thinking about that, you wonder, wait, what about all of his victims? Why don't they come back as ghosts in Wild Revenge too?
Well, they do come back. They all come back on that pizza.
That's right. Horrifying image.
There's just so much imagination in every film, and I feel like each filmmaker who takes on a Freddy movie, it's all about, well, what haven't we seen before? And you're not bound by the laws of reality.
I love the image of Freddy's hand just coming up in the bath because it's such a simple thing, but it's also such a good reminder that even the slightest thing of just his gloved hand can be such a threat of violence and of really bloody violence as well.
The character of Freddy Krueger is one that's tied up in a lot of iconography. The razor hands, the burned skin, they're all genuinely quite scary, but at the same time, he has a sort of playfulness to him and an ability to play to the camera and sort of make cruel jokes on his victims that we sort of become complicit in.
It really plays with this concept that within us, evil will always remain and will always continue.
The Overlook Hotel in The Shining works so well because it's kind of this eerie and uncanny space.
What's scarier to me even is their stillness. They don't have to move. They're ghosts. They have all the time in the world. They can come and get you and you can't outrun them. And I think that's stillness in horror movies is particularly terrifying to me.
The scariest scene for me, I don't even know why this is scary, but the guy in the dog costume, that scene has no business being as scary as it is.
So here's the difference between Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick. Stephen King will write an entire 20-page chapter about why there's a guest at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining wearing a dog suit. And then Stanley Kubrick will shoot for 5 seconds. And everyone will remember that image forever. And no one has to go searching back through the book to remember that it actually happened.
Stephen King famously hated Stanley Kubrick's The Shining because it deviated from his book in so many ways. The Shining is probably the most talked about horror movie of all time. And yet it's a film that never makes, you never feel like you've seen the whole of it or you understand all of it. It's like the film itself is kind of the Overlook Hotel itself. It's this haunted object, this object that defies logic and feels like a movie that, like the characters, maybe has always been here.
I think the Overlook Hotel in particular really speaks to this idea that buildings, as people go through them and live in them, the building is an organism in its own way. It carries the memories, it carries the pain, and it carries the joy and the tears and the fear of the people that were in it.
So you have this element of this ghostly presence that is maybe encouraging Jack to do these things, but at the same time, we also understand that Jack, long before the Overlook Hotel, was violent towards his family, and I think it's kind of that tension between the two of how much of this is the hotel influencing Jack and how much of it is just him being a violent human being. And I think it's kind of all the more frightening to realize that it's probably a lot of just him.
The Shining was not liked by critics. It was ignored by audiences when it came out in 1980. But today it really is one of the 2 or 3 ghost films that are utterly iconic and everyone knows a reference to. When we think of haunted houses, we think of cobwebs and candelabras and something very gothic. But what Poltergeist gives us is a haunted house with KitchenAid mixers, microwaves, and exercise equipment.
One of the great things Poltergeist does is bring a ghost story into daylight and into the suburbs.
Poltergeist takes the American dream of the suburban nuclear family, places them on a grave site, and then says, what does it mean for us to want this and forget where we came from, or forget the lives that were lost or lived before we got to here?
We've already made arrangements for relocating the cemetery.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, come on. I mean, that's sacrilegious, isn't it?
Oh, don't worry about it. After all, it's not ancient tribal burial ground. It's just people.
I think where Poltergeist is really trying to point the finger is in the idea of suburban sprawl without thinking about the consequences.
I think Tobe Hooper was really strategic in directing Poltergeist. Up until we find out the house is haunted, we see a TV on in every room. This is a family that is absolutely watching way too much of the boob tube.
As parents right now, we're always trying to pull our kids off iPads, right? But remember, as 80s kids, our parents were like, you're watching too much TV, you're gonna get sucked into the TV. Well, here's a horror movie that every parent's warning turned into this nightmare vision.
Poltergeist is a really great example of what fun can be had in that line between hard horror and comedy horror. It's a really fun film, and that's a tough line to walk.
At the time The Innocents was made, Hammer horror was really in vogue. But what sets The Innocents apart from this overarching trend in cinema at the time is how delicate it is, and how it chooses to walk this really fine balance between ghosts being real or the entire film being an imagination.
Quint is this great character because he is mostly just a presence, kind of a whispered about story. He was this drunk, lusty, sort of abusive man who, whether or not he is currently haunting the house, definitely haunts the minds of everyone in the house.
This is one of those films where there are people on either side of the argument as to whether or not these ghosts were real or whether they existed all in Miss Giddens' head. To me, I refuse to pick a side because both sides are just equally delicious.
Something that The Innocents is doing as well is making advancements in cinematography. The camera and the actors are moving in ways that are almost balletic.
It is so beautifully shot, from the exteriors to the decor to the costumes, and the story just flows like poetry. It's like a song to watch. I would never use these terms to describe a movie, but this one really warrants it.
There's a lot of claustrophobia in The Innocents, and this is achieved because the cinematographer utilized deep focus. We really get a sense of the world closing in on our lead character, played by Deborah Kerr.
During some scenes, you see that the edges of the frame are really dark, and that's because they were physically painting things on the camera lens that narrows us into these really intimate, claustrophobic scenes. It's a really effective way to bring the audience right up close and hold them with these characters and not let them out.
Rouge has a very interesting depiction of a ghost because it has the idea that a ghost might just walk around us and seem like a regular person.
Rouge is a film by Stanley Kwan, who you wouldn't really call a horror director, and it's a wonderful idea of a ghost story that is never once scary.
Rouge offers a really romantic take on the ghost story. In this story, we have the ghost of a courtesan named Fleur who has returned to the present in Hong Kong to seek a lover who she committed suicide with. And she's wondering, where is this person that she was supposed to meet in the afterlife?
Stanley Kwan's Rouge is kind of two movies at the same time. On the one hand, you've got this 30s period piece with this doomed romance. Then in the present day Hong Kong in the 80s, you've got this almost like a romantic comedy, but it's like one of the most beautifully shot ones out there, where a ghost kind of just shows up on this couple's doorstep and they, you know, figure out what to do with it.
Fleur is a really unique ghost because she doesn't look tattered or, you know, kind of look aged at all. She's probably one of the most beautiful ghosts in cinema's history.
The opening scene of Rouge is really captivating. We have Anita Moy as Fleur applying lipstick. It's such a simple sequence, but the way that it's shot under Stanley Kwan's direction, it is utterly captivating.
Anita Moy's performance in this is so otherworldly without being explicitly supernatural. She has this stillness, this lack of affect. She feels like a photo, someone out of place.
I love the sequences in Rouge of Fleur, this 1930s figure wandering around 1980s Hong Kong with its neon. It's such a distortion of time and place.
It's a ghost story that has a few chills in it, but at the end of the day, it reminds you that the thing that is most scary is loving too much.
Slimer is really the, you know, byproduct of this merchandise frenzy in the 1980s.
Post-Star Wars, merchandising for film became the hugest thing. And you see that in Ghostbusters. They are designing ghosts like Slimer and Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to be action figures.
There is a reason that Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and Slimer were the two that made it into the merchandising. Because every other ghost in Ghostbusters is one big sex joke, okay? There's the ghost that gives Dan Aykroyd's character head, there's the two horny demons, there's Sigourney Weaver's haunted character that just wants to sleep with Bill Murray. All of Ghostbusters is one big sex joke.
Slimer is the kind of ghost you would find rummaging through your garbage in the back of your house.
The story goes that he was supposed to be the ghost of John Belushi, who of course was supposed to be in the movie before he passed away. So they kind of changed his role to a ghost.
There's a great story about designing Slimer where Steve Johnson says all he was really told was a smile with arms. So he started watching John Belushi clips. Apparently he started doing cocaine, and he came up with the final design for Slimer.
Making the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man was also really, really challenging. They built a full foam suit, and the guy inside the suit couldn't actually breathe, so they had to like pump air in there in order for him to not turn into a ghost himself. And they had to build this tiny set for him to march around on. And every one of those cars is the same car that's been modified because they couldn't find them at the right scale. They went to crazy lengths to get these shots, and the effect of it is so great. He's so massive and he's so terrifying, even though he has no right to be.
Topper is one of the first kind of big ghost franchises of the 20th century in cinema. There are multiple Topper movies, there was an early TV show of Topper, and they're all kind of telling the story of, you know, the idea of a ghost flipped on its head.
It was a film that really merged the supernatural with the screwball comedy. It's a film that predicted a lot of the ghost comedies that would come many decades later, and it's a film that gave us Cary Grant as a ghost.
This is really a defining role for Cary Grant. We hadn't really seen him do a lot of stuff like this up till now, which is very weird to think of because now we think Philadelphia Story, we think Bringing Up Baby. This is the movie that is going to bring him into those roles. It's showing that not only is he very hot, he's also really, really funny.
I think we tell someone our good deeds, and then they open up the beautiful gates and let us through.
Yes, but what good deeds have you done?
Oh, dozens.
I think it really says something for, you know, roaring 20s into the Depression era of the 30s sensibilities, when the idea of two do-nothing accomplishment ghosts, how they're going to earn their way into heaven is to have their best buddy, who's a bit of a fuddy-duddy, drink, potentially cheat on his wife, carouse, have a good time. It's like, wouldn't that put you on, like, the bad end of the spectrum?
It is very, very silly. The special effects were dazzling. They look terrible and hokey now because, of course, they were process shots from 90 years ago. But They are charming. There's a handcrafted feeling to it.
Obviously, a large part of the humor is these gags where, you have little props on fishing wire or like a ghost dog stealing someone's swimming trunks. It's all just kind of silly stuff happening. But at its core, it's still this idea that a man is learning from the dead how to appreciate life more.
Ugetsu is a ghost story that shows how beautifully the Japanese can tell a ghost story.
In North America, we treat a ghost story usually as a horror film. In Japan, it's not that one for one. It's a little bit more complicated.
So often you have ghost stories that are about the loss of the ghost. Here, ghosts become almost agents of loss. Ghosts become figures that seduce or tempt or draw characters away from their everyday responsibilities.
One of the things that makes Ugetsu so haunting is that in the film, you gradually sense that desire itself is a kind of ghost, and that the object of desire is itself something phantasmagorical, something elusive that will forever slip between the fingers of the person desiring it.
There is so much tragedy and pathos layered in Kinyo Tanaka's motherly character, a wife who this whole movie tries to convince her husband to not be greedy and to not go away and to stay at home to protect this family, who ultimately tragically dies and is no longer there.
It's a movie, I would say, as ghost stories go, it feels so incredibly death-tinged, even up to and including this incredibly famous final shot set in and around a gravesite.
Many of the most beautiful, the spookiest, and most memorable scenes in Ugetsu are photographed from a significant distance and also from a certain unearthly height, so that you feel, in a sense, that the person watching the action may themselves be a ghost.
Death just hangs over the events in this movie, and whether it's a movie about characters who make mistakes or characters who have this inexorable sort of fate and this inexorable sense of tragedy, it gives you a sense of where all roads lead.
Vertigo is not a traditional ghost story, and yet every character is haunted by something.
In a nutshell, Vertigo is about an ex-cop who gets a job following a woman. And the woman that he's following, she's obsessed with a woman named Carlotta Valdez, who died of suicide more than a century ago.
Vertigo is a very interesting look at ghost stories because you are seeing in this idea of Carlotta Valdez and possession what compels somebody to believe a ghost story. That ghost stories are so ingrained in our culture that somebody like Scotty, who is pretty rational, he's a police detective, he might start to believe if you show him enough paintings and talk about enough curses and suicides and potential ghosts.
The camera work in Vertigo is some of the most subjective and expressionistic of Hitchcock's career, especially in color. I'm thinking in particular of this push-in on Madeline's spiraling bun on the back of her head.
The scene where we have Judy completely made over as Madeline, as she emerges from this green fog out of the bathroom light, it is one of the most ghostly images I can think of in film history, even though she's not a real ghost. You think Vertigo is a ghost story, and suddenly, in the middle of the movie, it's revealed to be an illusion. Vertigo deceives its audience, and I think this is why critics were so cold to it. But ever since its release, moviegoers and critics alike have kept coming back to Vertigo. I think a lot of people are haunted by this film.
Ghost is a love story, and it's about love after death, love after heartbreak, and love after grief and sorrow. And you see this sort of emotional growth, if that's possible, that happens to Sam, played by Patrick Swayze, after he dies. It's beautiful, it's funny, it makes you cry. I can't even think of pottery the same way because I only ever see Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze.
Everybody makes fun of Ghost because of the pottery sequence, but it's the earnestness, I think, that's kept it alive for, God, what, 35 years now almost? It's a completely above-board, honest movie about grief and sadness and loss. And because you have Patrick Swayze at his most perfect physical presence, he is putting all of this incredible tension into his chest and his arms and his legs. I mean, obviously the guy was a dancer. He knew how to do this stuff, but you can watch someone be sad in his neck in this movie.
I mean, the idea of taking a ghost story, you taking this figure that is a part of horror movies and making it something about yearning, making it about mourning, making it about the inability to touch someone. You know, this is a movie that its most iconic visuals are very tactile when you think of that sexy clay making sequence where the hands are rubbing against each other while forming this clay pot or whatever. And then to take that away and to yearn for that and to spend the whole movie where all you want to feel is Patrick Swayze's touch, like, they knew what they were doing.
I think why it was so enormously popular when it came out and remains enormously popular is that notion of missing someone so much, and the notion of, I wish I could touch you one more time, I'd give anything to touch you one more time. I think those are universal feelings.
It's very 90s in a way. Obviously, it's got twinkles and glitter and all that stuff. This thing is so much of its time and place and of its point in the culture that it endures forever, almost like it won't die.
Xibalba in the Book of Life is the ruler of the land of the forgotten. It's an animated film that came out a few years before Pixar's Coco and really imagined what the land of the dead would look like.
I think it's important to note with the Book of Life that this is very much a mythology inspired by Aztec, Mayan, and Mexican heritage, but isn't really presenting what is accurate to any of those cultures.
I like the Book of Life because it is playing a lot on kind of classic mythology, and you have these two kind of capricious gods at the center just playing with humanity.
Ron Perlman, who works with Guillermo del Toro frequently, is the voice of Xibalba, and he kind of brings out this ickiness to the character, this sort of creepiness and this authority that I think makes him really scary, but that's appropriate. This is the Lord of the Underworld.
In all my years, no one in any realm has ever talked to me like that and survived. So I ask you, are you threatening me, boy?
I think Book of Life is really underrated. It's super imaginative. The vision of life after death is colorful and based in a culture that doesn't really get shown on screen very much. And it's just so good, and I wish more people would watch it.
Ringu is such an interesting example of a horror film that takes something traditional and classic and fuses it with something modern. You've got the traditional Japanese ghost mixed with modern technology, the VHS tape.
Samara, or Yamamura, is actually based on the Yurei, which is a type of Japanese spirit that isn't buried properly, and it becomes restless as a result and haunts the people around them.
In Japanese culture, there is this idea of, forgive my pronunciation, the onryo of a vengeful ghost. And particularly they look at it with females often, as that's how they're often depicted. This person has gone through so much trauma and so much tragedy in their life that when it is their time to leave the earth, there's just so many things that went unfulfilled, and so they have to carry on in the afterlife before they're actually able to rest properly.
I feel like the movement of Yamamura as a ghost is so important. That kind of jerky, angular-limbed movement is so unsettling because it kind of falls into the uncanny valley.
I think why Sadako Yamamura is so creepy in Ringu is partially thanks to actress Rie Inoue, who was a kabuki actress. They actually played a lot of the footage backwards, so the movements are kind of extra jerky and supernatural.
As J-horror crested in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had a ton of films that traded on this similar imagery of spooky little kids. You had the Grudge films, you had other variations on this from across other Asian countries. It's one of those movies that was just sort of at the epicenter of a shift in the how and the what of what people found scary.
The horror genre in the late 90s was sort of entering the stagnant period where people were kind of like tired of all these self-aware slasher movies. They were kind of tired of all this comedy. And so The Ring just brought this sense of dread.
We never really get a sense of anything for the first 80 minutes. When we finally do get that incredible climax, which has defined a certain type of ghost story and horror movie ever since, it's an intrusion of the ancient and uncanny into a technological world. And, everybody has a TV. It would be pretty hard to hide from something like that.
There's so much to love in A Nightmare Before Christmas. There's so many great creatures. And I don't think that we talk about Zero, Jack's ghost dog, enough.
Zero in The Nightmare Before Christmas continues a great tradition Tim Burton has of considering potential life after death for dogs.
This isn't the first time that Tim Burton has made a film about resurrecting a pet. In fact, his calling card was a film called Frankenweenie. And so here you get again this idea of wish fulfillment, that in our afterlife we will be reunited with our beloved pets.
I really like A Nightmare Before Christmas that Zero is kind of everyone's dog. That the shape that Henry Selick, Tim Burton, the creative team give him is kind of no specific animal, so it can be whatever dog you want to project onto it.
Henry Selick's Nightmare Before Christmas, what an incredible musical, Christmas film, Halloween film. It incorporates so many different styles of stop motion, and there are certain characters that are sort of intentionally more fluid than others, and one of the best effects of the movie is Zero.
Every time you see Zero float, you have to think about that there was some person who went in and meticulously had to move the bottom of his robe so that it would look like one continuous motion, which is an incredible amount of work. It's an incredible amount of commitment to the craft.
Ghosts are so often this horrible, sad contemplation on yourself, on where you've come from. They have such gravitas. And what I love about Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas is it takes all these horrific concepts, these monsters that we've created, and shows what it's like for them to live happily together. And I love that Zero is a ghost dog because it touches on this really beautiful thought that the loyalty of a dog transcends its lifetime.
Ghost stories have existed since the dawn of folklore, and I think as long as we have movies, we'll continue to have spooky ghosts, funny ghosts, any kind of ghost you want.
They can be friendly, they can be malevolent, they can be kind of neutral. And so I think you can kind of take this idea of a ghost story and really adapt it to any genre.
I think we'll get tired of putting ghost stories on film when we figure out what happens to us after we die. Until then, we're gonna be making ghosts forever.
Perhaps it's a useful exercise to ask yourself, what kind of ghost are you going to be?